Lone Cowboy discovered a Navajo maiden tied to a post with a note, "Trespassers beware." The sun was a dying ember in the sky, bleeding gold across the endless stretch of the Wild West. Shadows stretched long and lean over the cracked earth, where sagebrush clung to life, and the wind carried whispers of secrets older than the canyons themselves. Daniel Boone rode slow and steady atop Rusty, his chestnut mare, her hooves kicking up dust with every step. His hat, weathered by years of sun and storm, sat low over his brow, shielding eyes that had seen too much and said too little. The leather of his chaps creaked against the saddle, a quiet song in the stillness of the desert morning. Daniel was a man carved from solitude, his days a rhythm of routine, on a ranch that was more refuge than home. He'd built it with his own hands after the world had taken everything else, his wife, his child, his hope stolen by outlaws in a night of fire and blood. Now he lived for the silence, the mending of fences, the tending of cattle, the occasional ride into town for salt and whiskey. Words were a rarity for him, his thoughts swallowed by the vastness of the land. The lines etched deep into his face spoke of a life hard-lived, a testament to the man who'd chosen to turn his back on the chaos of humanity. This morning was no different, or so he thought. He was out patrolling the edges of his land, a habit born of caution, when something snagged his gaze, a dark shape against the pale horizon, stark and wrong in the emptiness. He squinted, urging Rusty forward, his pulse quickening, despite the calm he wore like armor. As they drew closer, the shape became a figure, a woman bound tight to a wooden post planted deep in the dirt. Above her head, a scrap of parchment fluttered, pinned by a rusted nail, its message scrawled in jagged black, "Trespassers beware." Daniel reined Rusty to a stop and slid from the saddle, his boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He approached, slow, hand resting on the revolver at his hip, every nerve alive with the weight of the unknown. She was young, her hair a cascade of rich brown spilling over her shoulders, her eyes deep and beautiful, wide, with a fear that clawed at something buried inside him. She wore a dress of woven colors, Navajo by the look of it, the fabric worn but proud. Her wrists were red where the ropes bit into her skin, and her breath came in a shallow gasp as she watched him. "Who are you?" His voice rasped, rough from disuse, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Clara Mae Johnson." She answered, her words trembling but clear. "Please, help me." He stood there, caught in a storm of doubt. Who'd done this? What did that warning mean? Was she bait in some trap, luring him to a fate he'd spent years avoiding? The desert stretched empty around them, no sign of life, but the distant cry of a hawk. Still, he couldn't walk away, not from those eyes, not from the plea in her voice. He pulled his knife from its sheath, the steel catching the sunlight, and stepped closer. She flinched, then stilled as he sawed through the ropes, careful not to nick her skin. They fell away and she stumbled forward, catching herself as she rubbed her wrists, relief flooding her face. "Thank you," she whispered, so soft he almost missed it. He knotted his jaw tight. "What happened to you?" She drew a shaky breath, steadying herself against the post. "I was taken from my village. Men, white settlers, want our land. They tied me here, left me as a warning to my people." Daniel's eyes narrowed, his mind turning over her words. "You're Navajo, yes." She looked down, her fingers twisting together. "There's been fighting, blood spilled on both sides. They think they can scare us off, claim what's ours." He knew of the clashes, whispers carried on the wind from town settlers pushing west, hungry for land, clashing with tribes who'd called it home forever. He'd kept clear of it, a man apart, but now here it was, staring him in the face. Clara stood before him, fragile yet fierce, a spark of defiance in her, despite the ordeal. He felt a tug, a pull he couldn't name, something that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since before the darkness took his world. "We can't stay here," he said, scanning the horizon again. "Whoever did this might come back." Her gaze met his, searching, hopeful. "Will you help me?" He didn't answer right away. He could cut her loose and ride off. Let her find her own way. That's what the Daniel of the past year would have done, kept his head down, his hands clean. But something in her eyes and the way she stood tall, despite her fear, wouldn't let him turn away. He sighed a sound heavy with surrender. "Yeah," he said at last. "I'll help you." She nodded, a flicker of a smile breaking through her worry. He offered her a hand and she took it, her grip surprisingly strong as he helped her onto Rusty. She settled behind him, her arms circling his waist, and he felt the warmth of her against his back, a closeness he hadn't known in years. They rode off, the warning sign flapping in the breeze behind them, a ghost of the trouble they'd left behind. The ride to his ranch was quiet, the only sound Rusty's hooves and the hum of the wind. Daniel's mind churned with questions about her, about the men who'd done this, about what he'd just signed up for. He wasn't a hero, never had been. But here he was pulling a stranger into his life. Clara clung to him, her silence heavy with her own thoughts. She'd been raised in a world of family and tradition, a village alive with voices now torn apart by greed. This cowboy, this stranger, was her lifeline, and she wondered what kind of man he was beneath the quiet. When they reached his ranch, the sun was sinking, painting the sky in shades of fire. The place was humble, a cabin of weathered wood, a barn leaning slightly with age, a corral where a few horses grazed. It was a loner's domain, but tonight it had shelter too. Daniel helped Clara down, his hands steady on her waist, and she met his eyes with a gratitude that softened the edges of his guarded heart. "You're safe here for now," he said, stepping back. "I'll figure out how to get you home when the dust settles." "I don't know how to thank you," she replied, her voice warm, despite the chill creeping into the air. "Don't need to," he grunted, turning to tend Rusty. But as he worked, he felt her watching him, a presence that filled the empty spaces he'd grown used to. Night fell, and they sat by the fire in his cabin, the flames casting shadows that danced across the walls. Clara spoke of her village, red cliffs, and a river that sang a life woven with her people's stories. Daniel listened, drawn in by her words, the melody of her voice, easing the ache he carried. He told her a little of his own past, not much, just the bare bones of loss and retreat, and she didn't press, just nodded like she understood more than he'd said. "I never wanted this fight," she murmured, staring into the fire, "but it found me anyway." "Seems that's how it goes out here," he said, his tone softer than he meant it to be. "Trouble don't care who you are." She looked at him, then really looked, and he felt seen in a way that unnerved him. For the first time in too long, the silence of his life felt less like peace and more like a void, one she was starting to fill. As the fire burned low, they turned in her on a pallet by the hearth, him in his narrow bed. Sleep didn't come easy, for either the day's weight pressing down. Outside, the wind howled through the canyons, a wild song of promise and peril. In that lonely corner of the Wild West, where right and wrong blurred like the horizon at dusk, Daniel Boone and Clara Mae Johnson had crossed paths. What lay ahead was a tangled road of danger and discovery, a journey that would test their courage and bind their souls in ways neither could yet imagine. The desert night clung to the cabin like a heavy blanket, the wind's mournful howl weaving through the cracks in the wooden walls. Inside, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting a faint warmth over Clara Mae Johnson, who lay restless on her pallet. Her eyes traced the shadows dancing across the ceiling, her mind replaying the terror of the day, the rough hands that bound her, the cold laughter of the settlers, the endless hours under the scorching sun, with that cursed sign above her head. Yet here she was safe for now, under the roof of a man whose quiet strength both comforted and intrigued her. Daniel Boone's steady breathing from the other side of the room was a grounding rhythm, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Morning broke with a pale light creeping through the cabin's single window, painting the world in hues of gray and gold. Daniel was up before dawn, his boots scuffing softly against the floor as he stoked the fire, and set a pot of coffee to boil. Clara stirred her brown hair, spilling across the blanket, her eyes catching his as she sat up. There was a moment brief but electric where their gazes held his, guarded hers, searching, before he turned away, busying himself with the routine of survival. Coffee, he offered, his voice low, rough from the night. Please, she replied, standing to stretch her movements, graceful despite the ache in her limbs. She accepted the tin mug he handed her, the warmth seeping into her hands as she sipped the bitter brew. It wasn't much, but it was a kindness, and in this harsh land, kindness was a rare currency. They sat at the small table, the silence between them not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken questions. Daniel's eyes kept drifting to the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. He knew the men who left Clara tied to that post weren't the kind to let things lie. The warning on that sign wasn't just for her people, it was a dare, a challenge to anyone who'd defy their claim. And now, by cutting her free, he'd stepped right into their game. You said they were settlers, he said at last, breaking the quiet. You know their names, faces. Clara's fingers tightened around the mug. I saw two of them clearly. One called the other Hank. Big man, red beard, eyes like a snake. The other was younger, lean, with a scar across his cheek. They spoke of a boss, someone they feared. They didn't say his name. Daniel nodded, storing the details away. He'd heard of men like that, land-hungry, ruthless, hiding their greed behind the banner of progress. They'd been pushing into Navajo territory for months, stirring up trouble that spilled blood on both sides. He'd kept his distance, but distance was a luxury he no longer had. We need to move you, he said, setting his mug down. If they come looking, this place won't stay safe long. Clara's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face, before she masked it with resolve. I need to get back to my people. They'll be looking for me, and if they find me here... She trailed off, the weight of her words clear. Her village would see him as one of the enemy, no matter his intentions. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. Getting you home ain't simple. The trail's long, and those men will be watching the paths. We need a plan. She studied him, her gaze sharp, despite the softness of her features. Why are you doing this, Daniel? You don't know me. You could have left me there. He didn't answer right away, his eyes drifting to the fire. Why was he doing this? The question gnawed at him, stirring memories he'd buried deep: his wife's laughter, his daughter's tiny hand in his, the screams that haunted his dreams. He'd failed them, and that failure had carved a hollow place inside him. Maybe helping Clara was a way to fill it, even just a little. Or maybe it was simpler. Maybe those eyes of hers, fierce and vulnerable all at once, had stirred something he thought was long dead. I don't leave folks to die, he said finally, his voice gruff. That's all you need to know. She nodded, accepting his answer, though her eyes lingered on him, curious, as if she saw more than he meant to show. They finished their coffee in silence, the air thick with the promise of what lay ahead. Outside, Rusty snorted in the corral, and the distant cry of a coyote echoed through the morning mist. They set out soon after, Clara riding behind him on Rusty, her arms around his waist, her warmth a quiet comfort against his back. The trail wound through rocky hills and sagebrush plains, the sun climbing higher, baking the earth. Daniel kept his eyes sharp, scanning for movement, a glint of metal, a shadow out of place. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. Clara, too, was watchful, her head turning at every sound, her grip tightening when they passed a narrow canyon that could hide an ambush. As they rode, she spoke, her voice soft but steady, filling the silence with stories of her home. She told him of the red cliffs that glowed like fire at sunset, of the songs her grandmother sang, to call the rain, of the laughter of children weaving through the village. Her words painted a world Daniel could almost see, vibrant and alive, so different from the gray solitude of his days. He found himself listening, drawn in despite himself, her voice a thread pulling him closer to something he'd forgotten how to feel. You ever think about leaving this place, she asked suddenly, her breath warm against his ear. Finding somewhere the world don't feel so heavy. He grunted a half laugh. Tried that once. Built this life to get away. Ain't nowhere the world don't find you. She fell silent, but he felt her nod as if she understood. They rode on the miles stretching beneath Rusty's steady gait, the tension of the unknown binding them closer with every step. By midday they reached a shallow creek, its waters glinting under the sun. Daniel reined in Rusty, letting her drink and help Clara down. They knelt by the water, splashing their faces, the coolness a brief reprieve from the heat. Clara's hair clung to her cheeks, and she smiled, a small, genuine thing that caught him off guard, softening the hard lines of his face. "You're not what I expected," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Most men out here, they don't care." He looked away, uncomfortable with the warmth her words stirred. "Don't make me out to be a saint. I'm just a man." "A good one," she said softly, and he felt that ache again, the one that made him want to believe her. Before he could respond, a crack echoed through the air, a rifle shot sharp and close. Daniel's hand flew to his revolver, his body shielding Clara as he scanned the ridge above. Two figures stood there, silhouetted against the sky. Hank's red beard, unmistakable, the scar-faced man beside him. They didn't fire again, just watched their message clear. They knew where Clara was, and they weren't done. "Get down," Daniel hissed, pulling her behind a boulder. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady, the old instincts kicking in. Clara's breath came fast, her eyes wide but not panicked. She trusted him, and that trust was a weight he both carried and cherished. "We can't outrun them," she whispered. "Not on one horse." "I know," he said, his mind racing. The creek bed offered cover, but it wouldn't last. They needed to move to outsmart the men hunting them. He glanced at Clara, her face set with determination, and made a choice. "We'll head for the canyon up ahead. Narrow walls, good for losing a tail. You with me?" She nodded, her jaw tight. "I'm with you." They mounted Rusty and rode hard, the wind whipping past, the sound of hooves a drumbeat against the earth. Behind them, the riders followed their shadows, lengthening as the sun climbed higher. The chase was on, and in the Wild West, where trust was scarce and danger was everywhere. Daniel and Clara were bound together, their fates entwined in a dance of survival and something deeper, something neither dared name yet. The canyon walls rose like silent sentinels, their jagged edges clawing at the sky as Daniel Boone urged Rusty forward, the mare's hooves pounding a desperate rhythm against the rocky ground. Clara Mae Johnson clung tightly to him, her arms locked around his waist, her breath hot against his neck as they plunged deeper into the narrow pass. The air was thick with dust, the scent of sagebrush sharp in their lungs, and the echo of their pursuers' horses grew louder, a relentless drumbeat of danger closing in. The sun hung high, its glare bouncing off the red rock, turning the canyon into a furnace. But there was no time to falter, no room for hesitation. Daniel's eyes darted to every shadow, every crevice, searching for an advantage. The canyon was a gamble. Its tight walls offered cover, but also trapped them, a funnel with no clear exit. Behind them, Hank and the scar-faced man rode hard, their shouts cutting through the air, coarse and taunting. A second rifle shot cracked, the bullet ricocheting off a boulder to their left, sending shards of stone flying. Clara flinched, her grip tightening, but she didn't cry out. Her courage steadied Daniel, grounding him in the chaos, even as his heart thundered with the weight of their odds. "Hold on," he shouted, leaning low as he spurred Rusty into a sharp turn, following a bend in the canyon where the walls narrowed further. The path twisted the rocks, closing in like the jaws of some ancient beast, but it bought them a moment, shielding them from the line of fire. He could hear the men cursing their horses, slowing as they navigated the tight terrain. It wasn't much, but it was enough to spark a plan. "There's a split up ahead," he said over his shoulder, his voice steady despite the strain. "If we can make it, we'll lose them in the maze." Clara nodded against his back, her trust unspoken but absolute. "Do it," she whispered, her words a spark in the storm. The canyon forked, one path veering left into a shadowy crevice, the other climbing right toward a sunlit ridge. Daniel chose the crevice, guiding Rusty into the darkness, where the walls pressed so close he could feel their breath. The air grew cool, the light dim, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The sound of their pursuers faded, muffled by the rock, and Daniel slowed Rusty to a walk, listening hard. Clara's hands loosened slightly, but her body stayed tense, ready for whatever came next. They emerged into a wider chamber, a hidden pocket within the canyon, where the walls opened to a small clearing. A trickle of water ran through the center, glinting like a vein of silver, and scrubby pines clung to the edges, their roots twisting into the stone. Daniel reined in Rusty, his eyes scanning the space. It was defensible, a place to make a stand, if it came to that, but it also felt like a trap, a dead end, if they'd misjudged their lead. "We can't stay here long," Clara said, her voice low, urgent. She slid from the saddle, her boots hitting the ground with a soft crunch. Her eyes, those deep, beautiful eyes, flickered with a mix of fear and defiance as she studied the walls. "They'll find us." "I know," Daniel replied, dismounting and drawing his revolver. He checked the chamber, the click of metal loud in the quiet. "But we've got a minute to breathe. Let's use it." She nodded, moving to the stream to splash water on her face. Her movements quick but graceful. Daniel watched her for a heartbeat, struck by the way she carried herself, worn down by the day's horrors, yet unbowed like a willow bending in a storm. He shook off the thought, focusing on the task at hand. He led Rusty to a cluster of pines, tying her reins to a low branch, then scanned the clearing for signs of movement. The silence was heavy, broken only by the drip of water and the distant cry of a hawk. That's when they heard it, a low rhythmic thud, like the heartbeat of the canyon itself. Hooves slow and deliberate, coming from the direction they'd entered. Daniel's grip tightened on his revolver, his body coiling like a spring. Clara froze, her hand halfway to her face, water dripping from her fingers. Their eyes met a silent agreement, passing between them. No running now, only facing what came. "Get behind me," Daniel said, his voice a low growl. She hesitated, then moved to his side, not behind her chin, lifting in a stubborn show of strength. He almost smiled, but there was no time. The riders appeared at the mouth of the crevice, their silhouettes stark against the light. Hank, with his red beard and snake-cold eyes, led the way, his rifle resting across his saddle. The scar-faced man flanked him, a cruel grin splitting his features. But there was a third figure now, one Daniel hadn't expected, a tall man, lean and sharp, dressed in a black duster that seemed to drink the sunlight. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but his presence carried a weight that made the air feel thicker, heavier. "Well, well," Hank drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "The cowboy and the squaw. Thought you'd slip us." Boone Daniel's blood ran cold. They knew his name. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. It was personal, though he couldn't fathom why. He kept his revolver steady, his voice even. "Let her go, Hank. This ain't your land, and she ain't your fight." The man in black laughed, a sound like gravel underfoot, and stepped forward. "You don't get it, do you, Boone? This ain't about land or her people. It's about you." He tilted his head, his eyes glinting from under the hat, sharp and knowing. "You've been hiding out here thinking you could outrun your past. But the past don't forget." Clara's hand brushed Daniel's arm, a fleeting touch that anchored him. "What's he talking about?" she whispered, her voice tight with confusion. Daniel didn't answer, his mind racing. He'd buried his past deep, locked it away, with the pain of loss, but now it was rising like a specter. The man in black, he knew him, or knew of him, a shadow from a life he'd left behind. But how and why now? Before he could speak, the scar-faced man raised his rifle, the barrel glinting. "Enough talk," he snarled. "Finish this." Time slowed, the world narrowing to the glint of steel and the pounding of Daniel's heart. He shoved Clara down, diving to the side, as the first shot rang out, the bullet grazing his shoulder, hot and sharp. Pain flared, but he ignored it, rolling to his knees and firing back his revolver, barking twice. The scar-faced man grunted, clutching his side, but Hank was already moving his rifle, swinging toward Clara. She didn't freeze. With a speed that stunned Daniel, she grabbed a rock from the stream bed and hurled it, catching Hank in the chest. He staggered, cursing, and Daniel seized the moment, firing again. His shot hit true, and Hank felt his rifle clattering to the ground. The man in black didn't flinch. His eyes locked on Daniel, a smile curling his lips, as if this was all part of some twisted game. "Run!" Daniel shouted to Clara, scrambling to his feet. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the man in black, but Daniel grabbed her hand, pulling her toward Rusty. They mounted in a frenzy, the mare rearing, as another shot echoed this one from the man in black, who'd finally drawn his weapon, a sleek pistol that gleamed like death itself. They tore out of the clearing, the canyon walls blurring past the sound of pursuit hot on their heels. The man in black was alone now, but his presence was a storm, relentless and terrifying. Daniel's shoulder burned blood, soaking his shirt, but he pushed Rusty harder, the mare's strength, their only hope. Clara clung to him, her voice fierce in his ear. "Who is he, Daniel? What does he want?" "I don't know." He admitted the words bitter, but he did know deep down that this was no random chase. The man in black was a ghost from a life Daniel had tried to bury, and now that ghost was hunting them both. As they burst from the canyon into open desert, a new sound rose, a low rhythmic chant carried on the wind. Clara stiffened, her breath catching. "My people," she whispered, hope and fear warring in her voice. Ahead, a line of Navajo riders appeared, their silhouettes proud against the horizon, bows and rifles at the ready. Salvation or a new danger? Daniel couldn't tell, but the man in black was still behind them, and the truth of his past was closing in fast. The desert stretched endless before them, a sea of sand and scrub under a sky that burned with midday fire. Daniel Boone's shoulder throbbed, the blood from the grazing bullet soaking his shirt, but he gripped Rusty's reins tight, urging the mare onward as the chant of the Navajo riders grew louder. Clara Mae Johnson's arms were a steady anchor around his waist, her body pressed close, her breath quick with the mix of hope and dread that came with seeing her people on the horizon. Behind them, the man in black pursued his horse, a dark specter against the dunes, relentless as death itself. The air crackled with tension, every hoofbeat a countdown to a collision of fates. As they neared the line of Navajo riders, Daniel slowed Rusty, his eyes scanning the group. 6 men, their faces stern, their bows and rifles gleaming with purpose. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with silver streaking his hair, raised a hand, and the others fanned out, forming a half circle that pinned Daniel and Clara between them and the approaching danger. Clara's grip tightened, her voice a whisper. "That's my Uncle Sella. He'll listen. I hope." "Hope's a thin thread out here." Daniel muttered, his hand hovering near his revolver, though he knew drawing it would be a mistake. The Navajo riders' eyes were hard, their postures rigid, and he felt the weight of their suspicion like a physical thing. To them, he was just another white man, a potential enemy, no matter that he'd saved Clara's life. Sella rode forward, his gaze locking on Clara. "Clara Mae," he said, his voice deep, resonant, carrying the weight of authority. "You're alive." His eyes flicked to Daniel, narrowing. "And you bring a stranger." "He saved me," Uncle Clara said quickly, sliding off Rusty and stepping forward, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "They tied me to a post, left me to die. Daniel cut me free." Sella's expression didn't soften, his dark eyes boring into Daniel like they could see through to his bones. "And why would a lone cowboy risk his neck for you?" he asked, his tone edged with skepticism. "What's his price?" Daniel bristled, the question stinging more than the bullet wound. "Ain't no price." He said, his voice rough but steady. "Did what was right, that's all." The other riders murmured their words, lost to the wind, but their distrust was clear. Clara shot Daniel a glance, her eyes pleading for patience, but the moment was interrupted by a sharp laugh from behind. The man in black had reined in his horse just beyond the Navajo line, his duster flapping like raven wings, his face still shadowed, but his grin sharp enough to cut. "Well, ain't this a pretty picture?" He drawled, his voice smooth as venom. "Boone, you've got a knack for stepping into messes, don't you?" Daniel's jaw clenched, his hand itching to draw, but the Navajo riders shifted their weapons, trained on the newcomer. The man in black raised his hands, palms out, the gesture, mocking rather than surrendering. "Easy, folks. I'm just here for what's mine." "And what's that?" Sella snapped, his bowstring taut. The man's eyes glinted, sliding to Daniel. "Him." The word hung in the air, heavy as a storm cloud, and Daniel felt Clara's gaze snap to him, her confusion palpable. The Navajo riders exchanged glances, their tension spiking, and Daniel knew he was one wrong move from a fight he couldn't win. His past, whatever this man knew of it, was a noose tightening around his neck, and now Clara and her people were caught in it too. "Explain yourself," Sella demanded, his voice like thunder. "Who is this man to you, cowboy?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came. How could he explain what he didn't understand? The man in black was a ghost, a shadow from a life he'd buried, but the specifics were a haze of pain and loss. Before he could fumble a response, Clara stepped between them, her small frame radiating defiance. "Enough," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Daniel saved my life. Whatever this man wants, it's not our fight." She turned to her uncle, her eyes fierce. "Let us past Sella. Let me come home." Sella's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You vouch for him, Clara May." "I do," she said without hesitation, and Daniel felt a warmth in his chest, unexpected and disarming. She barely knew him yet. Here she was, staking her word on his worth. Sella nodded slowly, then gestured to his men. "Take them to the village. We'll sort this out there." He pointed at the man in black. "You stay back, or you'll taste our arrows." The man in black chuckled, unfazed, but he didn't advance. "Oh, I'll see you soon." Boone, he called as the Navajo riders closed ranks around Daniel and Clara, escorting them away. You can't outrun what's coming. The ride to the village was a blur of dust and tension, Daniel's shoulder burning, his mind racing with questions about the man in black. Clara rode beside him now on a borrowed horse from one of the riders, her presence a quiet anchor. But the awkwardness was inescapable. Her people watched him like a hawk watches a snake, and every glance reminded him he was an outsider, tolerated only because of Clara's trust. When they reached the village, nestled in a valley where red cliffs glowed like embers, the air shifted. Children ran through the dust, their laughter a stark contrast to the grim faces of the elders who gathered to meet them. Clara dismounted, rushing to embrace an older woman. Her mother, Daniel, guessed her brown hair catching the light as she moved. He stayed back, feeling like a trespasser, his boots heavy on the unfamiliar ground. Sella approached, his expression unreadable. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, not unkindly, but with no warmth either. "We'll talk at dawn. Don't wander." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Obliged. As Sella walked away, Clara returned, her face bright with relief but shadowed by worry. "They'll keep you safe," she said softly. "But they're cautious. You understand?" "Yeah," he said then, to lighten the mood, added with a wry grin. "Reckon I'm about as welcome as a skunk at a picnic." She laughed, a sound like clear water over stones, and for a moment the weight of the day lifted. "You're not that bad," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "Though you could use a bath." He snorted, glancing at his bloodied shirt and dust-caked face. "Fair point. Ain't exactly dressed for a social." Her smile faded, replaced by a quiet intensity. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just doing what's right." She studied him, her gaze piercing, and he felt that pull again, that dangerous warmth that made him want to stay closer than was wise. Before he could say more, a young boy ran up, tugging at Clara's hand, babbling about a feast. She let herself be pulled away, casting a glance back at Daniel that lingered longer than it should have. That night, the village came alive with firelight and song, the air rich with the scent of roasted meat and sage. Daniel sat on the edge of the gathering, his shoulder bandaged by a Navajo healer, who'd muttered about foolish white men, but worked with gentle hands. He watched Clara move among her people, her laughter bright, her grace effortless. She belonged here in a way he never had anywhere. Yet when her eyes found his across the fire, there was a spark of something new, something that made his heart stumble. But the peace was fragile. As the drums beat and the stars burned overhead, Daniel caught a glimpse of movement beyond the village, a shadow in the darkness watching. The man in black hadn't given up, and whatever he wanted, it was tied to a past Daniel couldn't escape. The drama of the day was far from over, and as Clara's laughter rang out, Daniel knew the morning would bring truths neither of them was ready to face. The firelight of the Navajo village flickered like a heartbeat, casting warm shadows across the faces of the gathered people, their voices weaving a tapestry of song and laughter that filled the desert night. Daniel Boone sat on the fringes, his bandaged shoulder a dull ache beneath the healer's careful work, his eyes drawn to Clara Mae Johnson as she moved through the crowd. Her brown hair caught the glow of the flames, each strand shimmering like polished wood, and her smile, bright, unguarded, stirred something in him that felt both dangerous and alive. The shadow he'd glimpsed beyond the village, the lurking threat of the man in black, lingered in his mind, but for now the warmth of the moment held it at bay. Clara broke away from the dancers, her breath slightly quickened, her cheeks flushed from the rhythm of the drums. She approached Daniel, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his pulse jump. "You're missing the celebration," she said, her voice light, but teasing a challenge hidden in the curve of her lips. "Ain't much for dancing," he replied, his tone gruff, but softened by a half-smile. He shifted on the log where he sat, suddenly aware of the dust on his boots, the blood still staining his shirt. "Besides, I reckon I'd make a fool of myself." She laughed, a sound that danced through the air like a spark, and sat beside him close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "You faced worse than a dance, Daniel Boone," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Saved my life, stood up to my uncle's glare. Surely a few steps wouldn't scare you?" He chuckled, the sound rusty from disuse. "You'd be surprised what scares a man." Her gaze softened, searching his face, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, the crackle of the fire, the distant hum of the village, the electric pull of something unspoken. She reached out her fingers, brushing his hand, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through him. "Come with me," she said, standing and tugging gently at his arm, away from the noise. "Just for a bit." He hesitated, the weight of her people's eyes and the threat beyond the village heavy on his shoulders. But her touch, her voice was a current he couldn't resist. He rose, following her as she led him away from the firelight, toward the edge of the village, where the cliffs loomed like silent guardians. The night air was cool, scented with sage and earth, and the stars above burned bright, a canopy of light that felt both vast and intimate. They stopped near a cluster of junipers, the shadows wrapping around them like a cloak. Clara turned to face him, her eyes catching the starlight, deep and endless. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "For what you did, for staying even when it's dangerous." "You don't owe me nothing," he said, but his words felt hollow, his gaze drawn to the curve of her jaw, the way her lips parted slightly as she breathed. The air between them thickened, charged with a heat that had nothing to do with the desert night. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his chest, her fingers brushing the edge of his bandage. "Maybe I want to owe you," she murmured, her voice carrying a boldness that made his heart stutter. "Maybe I want to know the man who risked everything for a stranger." He swallowed hard, his body tensing under her touch. Every instinct screamed to pull back, to keep the walls he'd built around his heart intact. But her closeness, the warmth of her hand, the way her eyes held his without flinching, it unraveled him. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "this ain't a good idea. Your people, my past, my people don't own me." She interrupted, her tone fierce but soft. "And your past doesn't own you." She leaned in, her breath warm against his cheek, and he felt the world tilt the boundaries he'd clung to, blurring like sand in the wind. He didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him, maybe her, but suddenly her lips were on his soft and urgent, a kiss that tasted of courage and longing. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer, the feel of her against him, igniting a fire he'd thought long extinguished. Her fingers tangled in his hair, her body pressing into his, and for a moment the danger, the pursuit, the weight of their worlds fell away. There was only her warmth, her strength, the way she fit against him like she belonged there. The kiss deepened a quiet hunger in every touch, but they kept it gentle, a dance of connection rather than conquest. His hands traced the curve of her back, careful of his wounded shoulder, while hers explored the planes of his chest, her touch both tender and bold. The night seemed to hold its breath, the stars above witnesses to a moment neither had expected, but both needed. They pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads resting together, the air between them, humming with unspoken promises. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you're going to be the death of me." She laughed softly, a sound that vibrated through him. "Good way to go, though, isn't it?" She teased, her eyes sparkling with mischief. He grinned a rare, unguarded smile, but before he could respond, a rustle in the junipers snapped them back to reality. Daniel's hand flew to his revolver, his body shielding Clara as he scanned the darkness. The shadow he'd seen earlier, the man in black, was out there watching, waiting. The moment of intimacy shattered, replaced by the cold grip of danger. "Stay here," he whispered, but Clara grabbed his arm, her grip firm. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We face this together." He wanted to argue to protect her, but the resolve in her face stopped him. She wasn't just a woman to be saved, she was a partner, fierce and unyielding. He nodded and they moved together, crouching low, their steps silent, as they crept toward the source of the sound. The junipers parted to reveal not the man in black, but a young Navajo boy, one of the village children, his eyes wide with excitement. "Clara, Daniel," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Sela sent me. Riders are coming, white men armed. They're close." Clara's breath caught and Daniel's jaw tightened. The man in black hadn't come alone, and the fragile peace of the village was about to be tested. The kiss, the moment of connection, was a fleeting light in the storm now gathering. Daniel took Clara's hand, his grip steady, and they ran back toward the village, the drums still beating, unaware of the danger closing in. The night was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield, and the bond they just forged would be tested in ways neither could have imagined. As the village came into view, the firelight a beacon in the dark, Daniel felt Clara's hand tighten in his, a silent vow that, whatever came next, they'd face it side by side. The village fires burned bright against the night, their glow a defiant stand against the darkness closing in. But the air was thick with the promise of violence. Daniel Boone and Clara Mae Johnson ran hand in hand, their boots pounding the earth, the boy's warning ringing in their ears. Armed riders, white men coming fast. The memory of their kiss, the heat of her touch, lingered like a spark in Daniel's chest, but it was overshadowed now by the urgency of survival. Clara's grip was fierce, her eyes alight with determination, and as they burst into the village, the drums fell silent, replaced by the sharp commands of Sela rallying his warriors. The Navajo men moved swiftly, their shadows merging with the night as they took up positions along the village's edge boughs and rifles at the ready. Women and children retreated to the safety of the cliffs, their faces taut with fear but resolute. Clara pulled Daniel toward Sela, who stood at the center of the chaos, his silver-streaked hair catching the firelight as he barked orders. "Uncle," she called, her voice cutting through the tension. "They're coming, white settlers armed." Sela's eyes flicked to Daniel, his expression unreadable, but heavy with suspicion. "You're doing, Cowboy?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to cut. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight. "Ain't my fight, Sela. But I'm here, and I'll stand with you." Clara stepped forward, her hand still in Daniel's, a silent declaration. "He's with me," she said, her voice steady. "He saved my life. Trust him." Sella's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Prove it," he said to Daniel, tossing him a rifle from a nearby warrior. "If you're one of us tonight, fight like it." Daniel caught the rifle, its weight familiar in his hands, though the gesture felt like a test as much as a necessity. He nodded, meeting Sella's eyes, and turned to Clara. "Stay close," he whispered, but she shook her head, her brown hair swaying with the motion. "I fight too," she said, grabbing a bow from a pile of weapons, her hands steady as she strung it. Her defiance, her courage stirred that ache in him again, but there was no time to dwell on it. The first shots rang out, shattering the night, and the village erupted into chaos. Riders burst from the darkness, their horses' hooves thundering, their faces masked by bandanas, but their intent clear in the glint of their guns. Daniel dropped to one knee, firing into the fray, his shots precise, felling a rider who'd aimed at a Navajo warrior. Clara stood beside him, her arrows flying true, each one a testament to her skill and resolve. The air filled with the crack of gunfire, the whistle of arrows, the cries of men caught in the sudden storm. But amidst the chaos, Daniel's eyes caught a figure on the ridge above the village. The man in black, his duster billowing, his pistol raised but not firing. He was watching, waiting his presence, a cold weight that chilled Daniel's blood. This wasn't just an attack, it was a stage, and the man in black was the puppeteer. The battle raged, the Navajo warriors holding their ground with fierce precision, their arrows and bullets cutting through the attackers. Daniel fought beside them, his rifle barking his shoulders, screaming with every shot. Clara was a force beside him, her arrows finding their marks, her face set with a fire that made her seem untouchable. But the settlers were relentless, their numbers greater than expected, and the village's defenses began to falter. Then came the twist, sharp and shattering like a crack in the earth itself. As Daniel reloaded, his eyes locked on one of the attackers, a man who'd fallen from his horse, his bandana slipping, to reveal a face. Daniel knew, a face that stopped his heart. It was Caleb, his brother, older, now hardened by years, but unmistakable. The same blue eyes, the same scar on his chin from a childhood fall. Caleb, who'd ridden with the outlaws that burned Daniel's life to ash, who'd vanished into the night after that blood-soaked tragedy, leaving Daniel to drown in grief. Caleb Daniel's voice was a broken whisper, lost in the din of battle. He froze the rifle, slipping in his hands, his world tilting as the past crashed into the present. Caleb was alive, and he was here fighting for the men who'd tied Clara to that post, who'd hunted them through the desert. The man in black's words echoed in his mind. You can't outrun your past, and now Daniel understood. This wasn't just about land or vengeance. This was personal reckoning, orchestrated by the brother he'd thought dead. Clara's hand on his arm snapped him back. "Daniel, move," she shouted, pulling him behind an overturned cart as bullets tore through the air. Her eyes searched his, confused by the shock on his face. "What's wrong?" He couldn't answer, his throat tight with betrayal and pain. Caleb was alive, and he was the enemy. The man in black had known, had used this to draw Daniel out, to trap him in a fight he couldn't escape. The realization was a knife in his gut, twisting with every memory of the family he'd lost, the brother he'd mourned. "Daniel, talk to me." Clara's voice was urgent, her hand cupping his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her touch grounded him, pulling him from the abyss of his shock. "My brother," he rasped the words, tasting like ash. "He's one of them." Her eyes widened, but she didn't falter. "We'll deal with it," she said, her voice fierce. Together. Before he could respond, a new wave of attackers surged forward, their shouts mingling with the Navajo's war cries. Daniel forced himself to move, his rifle raised, but his eyes kept searching for Caleb, torn between the fight and the ghost of his past. Clara fought beside him, her arrows a blur, her presence a lifeline in the storm. The man in black still watched from the ridge, his smile a promise of more pain to come. The battle reached a fever pitch, the village holding, but at a cost. Blood stained the earth and cries of the wounded pierced the night. Daniel spotted Caleb again, now locked in a struggle with a Navajo warrior, his knife flashing. Without thinking, Daniel ran toward him, dodging bullets, his heart a war drum. "Caleb!" he shouted, his voice raw. Caleb turned his eyes, meeting Daniel's, and for a moment time stopped. There was no recognition in his brother's gaze, only a cold, hard anger that cut deeper than any blade. "You shouldn't be here," Caleb said, his voice low, venomous. "You should have stayed gone." Before Daniel could respond, a Navajo arrow struck Caleb's shoulder, and he staggered, disappearing into the chaos. Daniel lunged after him, but Clara grabbed his arm, pulling him back as another bullet whizzed past. "Not now," she said, her voice a fierce anchor. "We survived this first." The fight surged on, but the twist of Caleb's return had changed everything. Daniel fought with a ferocity born of pain, his every shot, a question, his every move, a search for answers. Clara stayed by his side, her strength unyielding, their bond forged in the heat of battle. The man in black's shadow loomed larger, his plan unfolding, and as the night bled into dawn, Daniel knew the real fight was just beginning, a fight not just for survival, but for the truth of his past and the future he might dare to claim with Clara. The first light of dawn crept over the red cliffs, painting the Navajo village in shades of rose and gold. But the air was heavy with the aftermath of battle. Smoke curled from smoldering fires, and the ground was littered with the scars of the night-broken arrows, scattered gear, and patches of earth darkened by blood. Daniel Boone stood amidst the chaos, his rifle still warm in his hands, his heart a tangled knot of rage and grief. The sight of his brother Caleb alive and fighting for the enemy had cracked open a wound he'd thought long buried. Clara Mae Johnson stood beside him, her bow slung across her back, her brown hair tangled from the fight, her eyes searching his face with a mix of concern and resolve. The man in black was gone, vanished into the desert like a wraith, but his presence lingered, a promise of more trouble to come. The village was battered, but standing the Navajo warriors tending to their wounded with quiet efficiency. Sela moved among them, his commands steady, his silver-streaked hair catching the dawn's light as he organized a perimeter. He paused when he saw Daniel and Clara, his gaze lingering on their joined hands, a detail that hadn't gone unnoticed by the villagers, who cast curious glances their way. Daniel dropped Clara's hand, his cheeks warming despite himself, and cleared his throat. "We need to talk about Caleb," he said, his voice rough, trying to steer the moment away from the awkward weight of those stares. Sela's eyes narrowed. "Your brother, you said. A man who rides with our enemies." His tone was sharp, but there was a question in it, a demand for answers Daniel wasn't sure he could give. "He's not the man I knew," Daniel said, his words halting. "I thought he was dead. Years ago, outlaws took everything, my family, my home. Caleb was with them, or so I thought. Then he was gone, until last night." Clara's hand brushed his arm, a quiet gesture of support, but it only deepened the awkwardness. The village elder, Clara's mother, approached, her face a mask of stern curiosity. "You bring danger to our home, Cowboy," she said, her voice low but firm. "And yet my daughter stands by you. Explain this." Daniel shifted his boots, scuffing the dirt, feeling like a boy caught stealing apples. "Ma'am, I ain't here to cause trouble," he said, then, with a wry grin, added, "though trouble seems to have a fondness for me lately." Clara stifled a laugh, her eyes sparkling despite the tension, and her mother's lips twitched, though she quickly schooled her expression. "You have a quick tongue," she said, "but words won't mend what's broken here." Before Daniel could respond, a shout from the perimeter cut through the morning. A young warrior sprinted toward Sela, his face pale. "Riders coming from the west, 3 of them, 1 wounded. It's the man you called Caleb." Daniel's heart lurched, his hand instinctively moving to his revolver. Clara grabbed his wrist, her touch firm but gentle. "Don't," she whispered. "Let's hear him out. Hear him out." Daniel's voice was a low growl, the betrayal still raw. "He was shooting at us, Clara. At your people. And he's your brother," she countered, her eyes fierce. "You don't know his story yet." Sela gestured for silence, his authority unquestioned. "Bring them in," he ordered, "but keep them covered." The warriors moved swiftly, and soon Caleb was led into the village. His shoulder bandaged, his face haggard but defiant. Two other settlers flanked him, their hands raised, their weapons confiscated. Caleb's eyes met Daniel's, and the air between them crackled with unspoken history. Years of loss, of blame, of a bond shattered by blood. The villagers gathered their murmurs, a low hum, and Daniel felt the weight of their judgment, the awkwardness of standing between two worlds. Caleb, Daniel said, his voice tight, you got some explaining to do. Caleb's laugh was bitter, his blue eyes, so like Daniel's, glinting with pain. You think I wanted this? You think I chose to ride with those dogs? He gestured to his companions, who shifted uncomfortably under the Navajo's watchful eyes. I was a prisoner, Daniel, same as you were back then. They took me, broke me, made me their dog to keep me alive. Daniel's chest tightened to memories of that night, flooding back the fire, the screams the moment he lost everything. You were with them, he said, his voice shaking. You rode with the men who killed Anna, who killed our girl. Caleb flinched, his face crumpling. I didn't have a choice. They'd have killed me too. I've been running ever since, trying to survive. The man in black, he found me, used me to get to you. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, the drama of the moment swelling as Daniel processed the words. The man in black wasn't just a ghost from his past, he was a hunter using Caleb as bait to draw Daniel into a trap. Clara's hand found his again, her touch a steadying force, but the villagers' stares grew heavier, their whispers louder. One elder muttered something about white men's quarrels, and Daniel felt the sting of being an outsider, caught in a family feud that now threatened Clara's people. Tsella stepped forward, his presence commanding silence. This man in black, he said, his eyes on Caleb. Who is he? Why does he hunt your brother? Caleb hesitated, his gaze dropping. His name's Jericho. He was one of them, the outlaws who hit our ranch. He's got a score to settle with Daniel. Something from back then. I don't know the whole of it. Daniel's blood ran cold. Jericho. The name sparked a memory, a face in the firelight, laughing as the world burned. He'd thought Jericho dead killed in a shootout years ago, but now the pieces fell into place. This was no random vendetta. It was a reckoning, a debt from a past Daniel had tried to bury. Before he could speak, Clara's mother stepped closer, her eyes narrowing at Caleb. And you bring this trouble to our door? She asked, her voice sharp. You and your brother dragging your ghosts into our home? Caleb looked away, shame etched in his features, and Daniel felt a pang of guilt. He'd brought this storm, however unwittingly, and now Clara's people were paying the price. I'll fix this, he said, his voice low but firm. I'll find Jericho, end this. Clara's grip tightened, her eyes flashing. Not alone, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. We do this together. The villagers murmured, some nodding, others skeptical, and Daniel felt the awkward weight of their scrutiny. He was a stranger, a man with a past that had spilled blood on their land. Yet Clara stood by him, her loyalty a beacon in the storm. Tsella's gaze softened just a fraction as he looked at his niece. You've chosen a hard path, Clara May, he said. But if you trust this man, we'll hear him out for now. As the village began to prepare for what came next, Daniel caught Caleb's eye, the tension between them, a live wire. We ain't done talking, he said, his voice low, and Caleb nodded, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy. To lighten the moment, Clara nudged Daniel's arm, a playful glint in her eyes. You know, for a man who claims he's no hero, you're doing an awful lot of standing in the middle of trouble. He snorted, a reluctant grin breaking through. Yeah, well, seems I'm better at finding trouble than dodging it. She laughed, the sound a brief reprieve, but the drama loomed larger than ever. Jericho was out there pulling strings, and Caleb's return had cracked Daniel's world open. As the village braced for what came next, Daniel and Clara stood side by side, their bond a fragile but fierce light against the gathering storm, the awkwardness of their alliance only deepening the stakes of what lay ahead. The Navajo village stood resolute under the morning sun, its red cliffs glowing like a promise of endurance. But the air was taut with the weight of what was to come. Daniel Boone felt the eyes of the villagers on him, their trust fragile, but holding thanks to Clara Mae Johnson's unwavering stand at his side. Her hand brushed his as they stood near the fire pit, the warmth of her touch a quiet anchor amidst the storm of his brother Caleb's return and the looming threat of Jericho, the man in black, who'd orchestrated this chaos. The revelation that Jericho was tied to the outlaws who destroyed Daniel's life years ago had lit a fire in him, not just for vengeance, but for answers, for a chance to end the cycle of pain that had haunted him for too long. Sella gathered the warriors, his voice steady, as he outlined a plan to confront the remaining settlers and their leader. Jericho wants a fight, he said, his eyes flicking to Daniel. We'll give him one, but on our terms. The canyon pass narrow, defensible. We draw him there. Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. He's after me. Let me be the bait. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. No, she said, her voice firm, but laced with worry. You don't face him alone. He met her gaze, the intensity of her care softening the hard edges of his resolve. I ain't alone, he said, his voice low, a smile tugging at his lips. God, you don't. Her cheeks flushed, and a few nearby warriors chuckled, easing the tension for a moment. Sella's stern expression cracked a glimmer of approval in his eyes. You're a fool, Cowboy, he said, but a brave one. We move at dusk. The day passed in a blur of preparation, sharpening blades, checking rifles, and mapping the canyon pass. Caleb, still under watch, worked alongside the warriors, his movements heavy with guilt. Daniel avoided him, the wound of their shared past too raw, but Clara urged patience, her quiet wisdom a bridge between the brothers. He's lost as much as you, she said as they checked their gear. Give him a chance to make it right. Daniel grunted, unconvinced but unwilling to argue with her. Her presence, her belief in him, was a light he hadn't known he needed, and he clung to it as they rode out with the Navajo warriors, the setting sun casting long shadows across the desert. The canyon pass was a jagged scar in the earth, its walls towering and unyielding. The Navajo took positions among the rocks, their silence a weapon as deadly as their arrows. Daniel and Clara stood at the center of the pass, Rusty tethered nearby, their figures a deliberate lure. Caleb was with them, his shoulder bandaged, but his rifle ready, a tentative step toward redemption. The air was still the only sound, the faint rustle of wind through the sagebrush, until the thud of hooves announced Jericho's arrival. He rode in alone, his black duster stark against the fading light, his face no longer shadowed, but sharp and cruel, his eyes glinting with a hunger for vengeance. Boone, he called, his voice smooth as a snake's hiss. You've been a hard man to kill. Daniel stepped forward, his revolver steady, Clara and Caleb flanking him. Why me, Jericho, he demanded. What's this about? Jericho's laugh was cold-cutting. You don't remember, do you? That night, your ranch burning, your family gone. You shot my brother Daniel, left him bleeding in the dirt. I swore I'd make you pay. The words hit like a bullet, memories flooding back, flames, chaos, a desperate shot in the dark. Daniel's hand trembled, but he held his ground. I didn't know, he said, his voice raw. I was protecting my own. And now you'll lose everything again, Jericho snarled, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, Clara's arrow flew, striking his hand. He cursed, dropping the gun, and the Navajo warriors emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on him. Caleb stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Jericho's chest. It's over, he said, his voice steady, despite the pain in his eyes. You used me, turned me against my own blood. No more. Jericho's smile didn't falter, even as blood dripped from his hand. You think this ends with me, he taunted. The settlers won't stop. This land's theirs, and they'll burn it all to claim it. Sella stepped forward, his presence commanding. This land is ours, he said, his voice like thunder, and we'll fight for it as we always have. Jericho lunged for his fallen pistol, but Daniel was faster, his shot ringing out clean and final. Jericho crumpled his duster, pooling like ink, his threat silenced at last. The canyon fell quiet, the weight of the moment settling over them like dust after a storm. The warriors secured the pass, ensuring no other settlers followed, and Daniel turned to Caleb, their eyes meeting in a moment of raw, unspoken understanding. "I thought you were gone," Daniel said, his voice thick. "I blamed you." Caleb nodded, his own eyes glistening. "I blame myself. But I'm here now, brother, if you'll have me." Daniel hesitated, then extended his hand, and Caleb took it, their grip a first step toward healing. Clara watched her smile soft her hand, finding Daniel's arm a quiet promise of her own. They returned to the village under a starlit sky, the tension of the night giving way to a fragile peace. The Navajo welcomed them, their trust earned through blood and bravery. Sella clasped Daniel's shoulder, a rare gesture of respect. "You fought for us," he said. "You're welcome here, cowboy." Clara's mother approached her sternness, softened by gratitude. "You've brought my daughter back," she said then, with a teasing glance at Clara added. "And maybe more trouble than she's worth." Clara laughed, nudging her mother, and Daniel chuckled, a sound lighter than he'd felt in years. The village celebrated, the fires burning bright, the songs rising to the stars. Daniel and Clara found a quiet moment by the cliffs, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. "You staying?" she asked, her eyes searching his, her voice soft but hopeful. He looked at her, at the strength and beauty that had changed him, and felt the weight of his past lift just a little. "Reckon I might," he said, his hand finding hers. "Got a reason to now." She smiled, leaning into him, and they stood together, the desert stretching endless before them, a land of hardship and hope. The wounds of the past, Daniel's loss, Caleb's betrayal, the conflict between settlers and Navajo, wouldn't heal overnight. But in this moment, with Clara by his side and a new family around him, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years, a future worth fighting for. As the village sang on their voices a chorus of resilience, Daniel and Clara looked to the horizon, ready to face whatever came next together. The Wild West, with all its pain and promise, had forged their bond, and in its vastness, they'd found a home, not just in the land, but in each other. If you find it interesting, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment. Thank you very much.